So I'm going to be talking about mobile application development with Ext JS 6. Before we kick things off, does anybody here already do mobile development with Ext JS? So a fair few of you. So some of what I'm going to talk about should be familiar, and some of it may not be, and hopefully you'll go away learning something useful for your organizations. Just to give you a bit of an introduction into who I am. I'm Andrew Duncan. I come from Scotland, and I run a company over there called Swarm Online. You may have seen our booth in the breakout area, and basically we build apps for businesses across the UK and Europe predominantly. I've been using Ext JS for around about 6 or 7 years now, since 2009, and it's basically been a major part of my career. So much so that I have been involved in writing some books. So Ext JS Essentials is one of them. I wrote a cookbook as well for Ext JS version 4, and I've now got a team of people around me that share like-minded love for Sencha and Ext JS and everything that happens on the web. So yes, you can go and look at that. The only thing is, if you buy a copy and you review it, you've got to leave 5 stars. You're not allowed to leave 4 or less. That's mandatory. We don't like 4 stars or less. That's bad news. So just to kind of shape this talk, we're going to talk briefly about why mobile is important to us and why application development is important. Some of that we learned yesterday in Art's presentation, so hopefully I'm going to back that up with even more stats. And then we'll go into what are my 10 rules for building mobile apps with Ext JS. So there's really 2 key things on this slide that I want to raise to your attention. And the first one is 25%. So the third item along, 25% of all IT budgets next year are going to be deployed in tablets and smartphones. So a quarter of your organization's IT spend is going in that direction. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be building all your systems on an iPad or on an iPhone or something. It could just be that you're building throwaway apps, small applications for your users to do a nice quick task, but still it's a significant amount of budget is going into that space. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on that, because I envisage that you'll all be working more and more on mobile than you have over the past few years. And then the other one is an interesting one is in 2019, it looks like basically we're going to have another $50 billion of enterprise apps spend. So that's up from 2015 to last year. So that's less than 5 years, and it's increasing to $201 billion. So that's global, but that's still a humongous spend in our space. So further cements, our love and belief for the web, and obviously some of the predictions and news that Sencha were delivering to us yesterday in the keynote, I think are further, enhanced through some of these statistics as well. So the other thing as well, if we just look at the last 10 years, so smartphones have obviously played an important part in how digital technology is changing business. And then, web browsers and general cloud applications and so on, that's all been an important factor in us developing applications. But look at the next 10 years, and you can see in the top 3, well actually in the top 5, you've got cloud computing, tablets, smartphones, and mobile apps. I mean, that's basically everything we do all day, every day. So this is massive for us. It's massive for all the developers in your organization that aren't supporting this, because they're going to have to be supporting it more and more. Being at conferences like this and others helps you get into the right space. So that's just a bit of background into why I think web technologies are important and mobile apps are important to us. So let's actually get into the meat of this. So we're talking about 10 considerations, or what I'm calling Duncans Law for mobile dev. But these are the 10 things that we consider in our company every single time we develop a new application. So what we're going to go through things like rapid prototyping, connectivity and offline. These are big problems that we need to solve. Memory capacity and the number of components that you put on screen. So that all links to user experience and so on. And then just things like, this big native v hybrid debate. Are you building an app with Sencha this time, or are we going to use a different framework? Sometimes you've got to make your choice based on what your business requirements are. So yeah, there's quite a few people up the back. If you've got spare seats or spare space, and squeeze in so that people can sit down. But yeah, I'm sorry that we're in too small a room. Sencha obviously didn't think I was going to be popular enough, so for some reason. They thought the Scottish guy, nah. So let's kick on with rapid prototyping. So what's rapid prototyping all about? Well, for us, what we do is we basically go through a process with our new applications to build some sort of prototype. At the very least, we'll build wireframes and mock-ups of the application, and then deliver that to the business unit that's commissioning the application from us. So in our case, because we're an external consultancy, we're dealing with customers that are looking to have an application built. Some of them will already have chosen the technology, some of them won't have, and so we then help steer them in that direction. But normally we're not thinking about technology at this point. So this is a really good way to basically get your business users invested in the product that they're buying before you ever set your eyes or your team to any coding at all. It also is an absolutely fantastic way to figure out how to estimate the cost or the development time required to make your application. There is nothing like seeing a picture of what you're developing before you actually develop it, and then you can start to break down all the components and the necessary items that need to be looked at, and build up your task list for your Jira Kanban board or whatever you're using. And then ultimately you basically hopefully will succeed more with your business because you give them an accurate estimate rather than just saying, oh yeah, we'll take 3 weeks. You can actually say, oh, this looks more like 3 months or however long it's going to take. So how do you do this though? Well, for us, what we do is we try to focus on getting the components on screen as early as possible. So we'll sit down with the business unit, we'll basically take the requirements, just scribbling things out. Quite often I get designers involved in this, so you might want to find someone in your organization that does that, or maybe you've got someone in your team and they come along with their crayons, they'll start scribbling stuff down on paper, and then essentially they can then use tools like Sketch and Prototype. These are both brilliant tools for creating prototypes and mock-ups and wireframes of apps. And essentially what you're able to do is create a nice look and feel. You can go as far as creating a fully functional prototype in Sencha as well, and if you are rapidly developing applications anyway, then it is possible to create something in less than a week that's actually really quite usable. And the great thing here is that you're able to give those business users something tactile that they can feel and touch and look at, and that's a really good thing when you're trying to sell them the solution that you've come up with for them. So some examples of how we've done this. So on the left, we've got just an app, that's simple PDF. We just made a nice layout and a look and feel, presented that back to the customer. In the middle, we went a wee bit further and we used the tool Prototype, which you can download for Mac. And basically Prototype allows you to create engaging, sort of an engaging prototype that you can then swipe around and tap things. And you kind of build up events over time so that you can give your customer a journey that they can follow through. And ultimately that gives them the ability to see what they're getting. And then lastly, on the far end there, we've got another app that we put together as a prototype and connected that to a backend, and that was done with Sencha Touch. So that was for us a 2-week project for two people, and basically the 2 people, they sat in the business, they took the requirements, understood what it was, created a nice look and feel and worked with the customer, and then over a 2-week period came up with something that then they could present back to the CEO. And in this case, this was an energy giant, one of the really big energy companies over in Europe. So that's number 1. Number 2, UI and UX. This is really big, and particularly if you're coming from a desktop workflow and you're used to developing desktop apps, when you move to mobile, it's completely different, and you've really got to think about that. So first of all, what is UI and UX? Well, UI is obviously the interface, that's the look and feel of the application, and the UX is the user experience. So this is basically the journey or the path that your user will follow in order to complete a particular task. UI and UX don't need to go hand in hand, and particularly if you're building commercial apps for enterprise users, you don't necessarily have to worry too much about the UI. Although what we always find, and I'm sure you find this yourselves in your day-to-day lives, you prefer working with things that look nice and are easy to use than the difficult apps, and you probably get more complaints and general disgruntlement about all the old ERP systems that take ages to load, or they've got to press a million buttons to get to something, you know. So if you can give a good experience and a good user interface, even in an enterprise setting, then your users will thank you 100 times over. Some great examples of this in the real world are on the screen there. You can see you've got design where the architect or the landscape designers put a nice path in place, and then the users basically have decided, well, we don't like that design. We're just going to go and do our user experience on this and walk straight over the path in a nice diagonal line, ruining the grass in the meantime, which is funny. The other one as well, I don't know if like the architects seem to mess up when they build shopping centres. How many times have you pulled a door that doesn't open towards you, but there's a door handle? Why do they do that? You know, they should just have a push pad, and then you wouldn't jar your arm so much. So, you know, that's bad UX in the real world. We hate it, you know, and ultimately it's the same in the mobile world. So what sort of things can you do in order to get better at UI and UX? Well, obviously using Sencha Themer is going to make our lives 10 times easier now that the tool is geared up more for modern applications. So I'm excited to try that myself. But it's all about knowing your audience. You know, if you're building enterprise apps and your users are field workers, they're maybe working with gloves or their hands, and their workflow is that they've got to pick tools up and then pick an app up at the same time. Make big buttons, because that's going to make their life easier, particularly if you've got gloves to contend with. You could also think about things like where are they going to be using this application? If you put yourself in their shoes, you know, if they're going to be using it out and about in the sun, then you might want to consider a nice high contrast theme rather than something that would have lots of white in the screen, which is obviously going to be harder to view on a mobile device for them. So it's things like that. Generally speaking, keeping things simple helps. I know that often is a difficult thing to achieve because quite often your workflow will be very complex, and ultimately your educated user might understand that anyway. But on a mobile app, what we find is if you've got the equivalent desktop app, that will often have 90% more functionality than your actual mobile experience will have, because your mobile app is really just there just to gather some data and then complete a workflow as quickly as possible. And ultimately, good planning of your user journey is critical here. So that goes back to what I was saying in the rapid prototyping. So you can see here, this is a prime example. We've got a user journey of an app where we basically have created a map of the workflow that the user will follow when they log in. So in this case, they're logging in with Facebook. They're going to go through some pattern. There might be password resets and so on. And we basically built up an entire flow of an app. And this gives our customer the ability to sign off on the app, so that's good news, but it also gives our designers and our developers the ability to check that the workflow is going to work before they even start coding anything. So very important, I think. On the other side there, you've just got an example of a user interface that we would develop before actually coding. So again, this is an app we actually haven't made. We've just made some screenshots of the application. We're in the process of speaking with our customer to see now, are they happy to go ahead with that? Another few things to consider. Finger and the mouse are two different things, so you've got to remember that although you're using your finger like a pointer as you would on a PC or a desktop, there are complex interactions that you can do with a mouse that you can't really do with your finger. But likewise, there are other things that you can do with your finger that you can't do with a mouse. So the really obvious ones are things like tapping, swiping, and pinching. So we don't really have the concept of swiping and pinching on a desktop. Maybe we do now with the Mac trackpads and things, but in most enterprise scenarios, you tend to be using a mouse. There are things like double tap and touch start and touch end, and these are useful events to listen out for, but I would like a word of caution here is don't hide lots of functionality underneath something like a double tap or a long press, for instance. You know what it's like with your own apps that you're using on your smartphones already. Most of these apps don't use these interactions because it's quite difficult for the user to find stuff in the app. They can't just guess by figuring their way around and doing long taps on everything. Quite often the user doesn't know that it's there. So I would urge you not to do that in your mobile apps as well. ultimately the goal should be that you're aiming for zero training to your user. If they're already using the desktop app and you present them with a mobile version of your desktop app, why have them go through more training in order to use that app, in my opinion anyway. Sometimes that's not always the case and every industry is different, but that's something that I would definitely try and look out for. And then it's just a case of trying to put yourself in the user's shoes. If you think about your own experience, so you finish work 5:30, you're on the train home, and you start getting Facebook and your news app open and everything else, and all of a sudden you're using great apps. Try and copy what those guys are doing and put that into your own app. Your users will thank you because they're already used to using that anyway. Just plagiarize the hell out of it, in my opinion. Just don't call it Facebook. So number 3, throwaway apps. So we find that, I would never have normally talked about this, but we just find that this year we're building more and more applications that are temporary, and they're fit for a purpose, and the purpose tends to just last for a short period of time and then they go away. And so I thought I'd put this in here because I imagine this is going to crop up in your organizations as well, and maybe with some of your requirements. Basically, throwaway apps are brilliant, but you've got to consider the purpose of them, and I guess you've got to make sure that you can evaluate the return on investment as well as you possibly can ahead of time, because ultimately you want to enhance the engagement of, say, the event. So if you think about SenchaCon's app just now, they've created for us as a throwaway app. We're probably going to have it installed, until this evening, and then maybe uninstall it from our devices or leave it there but probably never return to it again. I'm sure Sencha want us to engage beyond that, but ultimately that's probably what's going to happen, because we'll move on and tomorrow we'll be on to a new thing. So there's that, and the other thing is that there's also the thing that for some users your app is throwaway anyway. So if you just think about in this sort of consumer space, you might be traveling to another city or going to another country. You might download a bunch of apps relating to that country or city, coupons, whatever it is, use them for a few days and then delete those apps because you don't need them. So 2 different things, because you've obviously got a longer lifespan with those apps, and they'll typically be used by lots of users over a long period of time. But a throwaway app can be something that is definitely something that I think your organizations will be considering, whether it's just for your own corporate dues or if it's for external engagement with customers for competitions or whatever. You'll find that more and more of this will crop up, I imagine, in your development. So what can be good about throwaway apps? Basically, less is more with these things. Firstly, it makes it easier for you to develop. The chances are that you'll be given no time to develop it anyway, because someone will have the bright idea 2 weeks before something's meant to happen. And the thing about throwaway apps is you've got to get them on the App Store as quickly as possible. So if you're not already publishing to the App Stores, there's a bit of a rigmarole to get there. So if you need to sign up with Apple and then go through various verifications and so on. So that takes time. And then actually deploying your app to Apple's App Store anyway takes a couple of days. It's not just an instant thing. So they go through a review period. You basically do your deployment, get all your source code together, submit it to Apple, and then it takes about 2 to 3 days normally to have Apple review it, and they may reject it. That's the other thing you've got to just be aware of. Although that's rare. If you read their T's and C's and what their requirements are, then you should be able to circumvent that before you even submit anything. Apple's timeline changes from time to time. So at the moment, if you submit an app, it's actually quite fast, I think. I think it's only about a day to get the app reviewed, but 12 months ago, it was about 5 days, and that fluctuates throughout the year. And I suspect that probably coincides with all their events and their software releases and things. So it's just worth noting that. Android's a completely different kettle of fish. You can submit an app to the Play Store, and it can basically be live within a few hours normally, unless there's something going wrong at their end. But normally it's very fast. So that's something to consider. So a quick example, this is a Sencha app that we put together for a festival, and really it's just to allow the festival goers to vote for beers. So there's quite a big craft movement in the UK just now. I'm sure it's the same over here, and basically we've got festivals cropping up all over the place. This was a great way for the organisers to engage with their users in a sort of new way, and then give the user the ability to read about the beer, not have to print so many programs. So they made a saving there, and ultimately they could engage and get the punters to buy more things while they were at the festival. So that's an example of how we've been doing that. And with Sencha, you can do this really fast. Basically that's the great thing about a Sencha app is you're building one view. It will work on Android and iOS, and even Windows in some cases. Basically, you don't have to, putting the theme on that is not complicated. It's just a bit of CSS because it's just a website ultimately. These sorts of apps should only take upwards of 2 weeks to put together end to end. So that's a quick example there. So right, this is number 4 and 5 together, because basically this is getting into the real nitty-gritty now of coding. We've kind of gone through getting our requirements and understanding what the user is expecting, and now we're thinking about, okay, connectivity and working offline. These are two things that are actually particularly hard to work with, particularly given that we're not in control of connectivity, sadly. And whenever we're developing apps, I don't know about you guys, but we have amazing broadband in our office, and Wi-Fi is probably enterprise grade for 3 people, and it always works. And then you give it to the customer, they use it in their environment, and it never works. So you've got to just be aware of that. Get your apps out and about and test them before handing them over. Connectivity is a really important one here. If you're building desktop apps, the chances are you're able to throw a lot of data down the pipe to the front end in the mobile world. Although we've got LTE and 5G is coming in the next few years, and we're all excited about that, in reality, the connection can often be quite slow. You're not just limited by the fact that there's say, even if it's a 3G connection, it could be that your mobile provider's got some clog up at their end because there's lots of users on the network at that moment in time. Think about large events happening like football games and the likes, and that often slows the network down anyway. So consider that. Don't send data to the users. Sorry, my connectivity myself here. This is quite timely, isn't it? So yeah, basically, don't send all the data. If you're only send what the user really needs, and if you're only going to display 3 or 4 fields of information or whatever, just send 3 or 4 bits of information to the device. And then when it comes to working offline, so I was really excited about Sencha's announcement yesterday because, whoops, I've just damaged my thing. Sorry, put it all back together. Their announcement yesterday was really exciting for me because about 3 years ago I came to SenchaCon and I gave a talk on creating apps that work offline, and at the end I had this slide. It was really a throwaway comment at the time, which is service workers are going to be the next thing for doing offline mobile apps, and we're now in 2016 and now we're gradually seeing that come through. So I know I'll be getting Sencha Command 6.5 or whatever it is and trying that out because I have a feeling that's going to really help. So basically, a couple of ways that you can do this though, and what I would do is I would urge you to look at my other talk because I go through it in a lot more detail and you get 50 minutes of it there. But essentially you've got HTML5, it has various mediums for storing data, and Sencha provides us all the proxies that we need in order to connect to that. So there's things like session storage, local storage, there's IndexedDB and various other things. Just bear in mind that not everything's compatible with every device. So if you're deploying to some older devices, just double check to make sure that everything is compatible. Local storage is basically universal these days. If you're packaging your app with Cordova, there's a really good SQLite plugin, and basically SQLite is a relational database that you can put on the device, and that means you can get all your data off your back end, store it relationally in the SQL database, and then you can query it from your front end, which is really fantastic, and that gives you the ability to store even more data well, we think it's a really good way to store data anyway. And then obviously I updated my slides yesterday in blind panic when I learned about Sencha's new service worker functionality, so I'm looking forward to giving that a shot, but I haven't tried it in the real world yet, so I don't know what it's actually like. Hopefully it is ready for general consumption very soon. So just some examples of how we have done this in the past. So this is an application here that is essentially for field workers. So they're working their way through tasks and jobs, and quite often they can be out and about working for 7 or 8 hours at a time. Their connectivity is limited because they might be on an oil platform, and oil platforms typically have very limited connectivity given that they tend to be offshore, and everything has to be communicated through a sort of a low bandwidth satellite connection. So what we do is in the morning we get all the data put onto the device, as early as we possibly can before the worker starts their job or their day of work, and essentially we store it in a SQLite database on the device. And then so you can do that without having to write code for each of the platforms. So this particular app works on Android, iOS, and Windows, and Cordova has made it cross-platform compatible for us, which is extremely useful. So we can write once and then store the data into the device, and then ultimately what we do is we get our front end, so that's our Sencha code, to connect to the it's almost like a mini backend that we've put or a mini server, a web server that Cordova then serves that data up to the front end, and then we can store it in the Sencha store and on the DOM for use and consumption by the app. But if the user decides to close the app, it's no big deal, the data's still there. The other great thing is that if you are running background tasks and things, you can carry on syncing data and getting data to your SQLite database, and so you can be basically allowing the user to not even be aware that their device is working in the background, but you can be consuming some of their bandwidth, which is an extremely useful piece of functionality if you're creating this type of app. So yeah, you can imagine if you are on something like a low bandwidth part of the world, then that type of functionality is really good. It's not just as easy as 1, 2, 3 though. You do have to put some thought into it, and if you're developing that type of solution, it's probably worth coming up with a decent architecture, and then typically I think it probably takes us somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks to put together all the code that's required to enable that to happen. It's not just an overnight, you'll have it all sorted in 2, 3 days type of task. So that's just a word of caution, okay? So number 6, memory capacity and number of components. Well, this is obvious surely to everybody, but it's amazing how quickly you can forget. And I'll tell you one thing, your end user or your customer, they don't consider anything like this. They don't know that a phone has less capacity than a laptop, and they just don't understand that concept. So when your business buyer is coming, or your business is coming to you and saying, I need an app, they'll just chuck all the functionality at you, think you're going to make it all happen, and you as the whiz kids are going to fix it. But in reality, we've got to think very carefully about how we do that. So look at the information here. So an iPhone 6, very common device at the moment, even in enterprise, it's a common device. It's only got 1 gig of RAM. Samsung S6 has 3 gig, so that's good. We've got a lot more to play with there. And then your average laptop that you're building your Ext JS apps for is probably around about 4 gig, maybe even more these days. The RAM has become so cheap, but it's still not on our nice Swish iPhones, sadly. So what do we do in order to circumvent this and basically maximize our abilities here? Well, number 1 is basically reduce the number of components that you're sending to the screen. So if your business comes to you and says, I want you to present 100 fields to the user, think about how you can split those 100 fields up into multiple screens. Firstly, you'll give them a better user experience because they won't be scrolling so much, but secondly, you'll be able to render the screen a lot faster. Just remember that JavaScript is still a single-threaded language, and that's still the same, sadly, on mobile devices. Nothing has changed there, and so it has to go through the iterative process of rendering all of that, all of the stuff on the screen, and then go through all the data as well, which quite often you can be trying to put thousands of records of information on a front end, and that's like completely normal, but it's just something we've got to consider. When you leave the screen, it's really important to clean up after yourself. So this will give you precious memory back, okay? So the destroy method in Sencha's, on nearly every component in Sencha, just call it everywhere, wherever you can. Just destroy everything. And set internal references to null. So if you basically have important elements, like you've got a big screen, you can obviously set that with a variable, and then ultimately nullify it, and your garbage collector in your browser will then go through at its next cycle and clear all the references away and give you that memory back. I should maybe mention at this point, okay, I have 2 things that I hadn't thought about. So number 1 is at the last SenchaCon, I gave a talk on memory leaks and memory performance. Go and watch that talk, because that basically tells you all of this in much more detail. That's important. Number 2 is one of my colleagues wrote a blog post about 2 weeks ago, I think, on 9 performance tips with Ext JS. So if you go to our blog, which is swarmonline.com, and then it'll be one of the first articles there. Have a look at that, because the Ext JS, well, we're thinking of it from a desktop and a mobile perspective, but it's worth looking at that because the principles that he's mentioned in this blog post apply to mobile. So I think I've got the URL on the last slide if you don't remember that, but it's worth looking at that. So here's an app for another energy company that we were working on. Actually, this is one that I think they had about 150 fields per job, so bits of data that they're expecting their engineers to gather every time they go and service a meter. So what we decided to do was basically turn this into a wizard, and then we only render approximately 10 fields per screen, roughly, and that's good user experience because the user knows where they are in their job and they can work, take some data, put their app down, pick their tools up, and then carry on working, and then go vice versa, and then work on the app. But also, it means that the screen rendering time is greatly reduced. So if you try and render 100 components in one go, then that can take a long time, particularly on an older device. So it's well worth considering something like that. The other thing you should do is consider the component hierarchy. So in the docs are really well laid out for us in that they tell you the component hierarchy for every component in the framework. If you're going to use something like a panel, think again. You might not need a panel. Go to consider using a container, or maybe even just a straightforward component. You don't necessarily have to use all the heavyweight items of the framework. The other thing you can do here as well, which is quite clever, is if you're going to be using, say, the panel lots in your own app, and the panel comes with, I don't know, it must have like 100 methods associated with it, and therefore, and config options, and therefore millions of getters and setters. You could also consider just overriding the panel to make your own custom version of a lightweight panel, which just has the stuff that you need in it. Rather than using Sencha's default one. That's a trick that we tend to use with some of our apps. And that way we're getting the benefit of the framework because we still get the features that we want for our application, but we don't necessarily need to include all the extra bulk that goes with that. Data handling is important as well here. So it's extremely important that you only send the data that you need to the browser. That's number one. And then number two is data complexity. Try to reduce the complexity as much as possible. So as a developer, I love nested data. I think it looks nice. It's nice for me to be able to read and interpret and understand. But when it comes to the CPU and on your mobile device, it's got to iterate over all of that, and the more nested it is, the more iterations it has to do. So just have a wee think about that before you put lots of nested data into your app. We've also found, and I don't know if this is still the case with the more recent versions of the framework, but certainly in older versions and in Sencha Touch, that sometimes using data associations was slightly less performant for us than just using very flat structures. So we've typically stuck to just keeping our structures as flat as possible in our apps. But that's just because it's been a requirement for us and our customers, I suppose. And then last but not least here, you've got to just remember that you're still dealing with a browser. It's no different to developing your desktop app. The browser, even though it might be Cordova that you're wrapping your app in, it's still just opening up a web view, which is WebKit. So it's important to keep that in mind. So I think we're on to, is this number 6 or 7 maybe? Not sure. We're getting there, hopefully. So what are your consumer expectations? This is something that is cropping up more. We've been developing a lot of enterprise apps, and now we're finding more and more companies coming to us asking for consumer apps as well. And I have a feeling that is because, although we pitch ourselves as a hybrid app development company, I've got a feeling that more and more people are beginning to understand that hybrid app development is actually a really good way to develop an app. It's a lot cheaper, and you can typically deploy a lot faster with far fewer developers. So you've got to think about simple things like fast performance and ease of navigation. Your consumers are going to vote with the stars or the star rating on the App Store, and as soon as they put a 1-star down, that doesn't help. That doesn't help you. It's nice to get the feedback, I suppose, but you really don't want to get that type of feedback. So I've put what seems really obvious at the bottom here: no major bugs. But this is absolutely true for a consumer app. Don't put big bugs into the app. If it breaks, your consumer will vote with a 1-star. See, the converse of that is in the enterprise, it's totally different. You can have major bugs in the app, and as long as the workflow is still working just enough for the user to be able to do their job, they'll circumvent that bug anyway, or they'll learn how to get around it, because they know they've still got a job to do, and they're targeted to get that job done. So you've got to think of your customers slightly differently when you're dealing with consumers versus your enterprise customers. The other thing that I often find as well with enterprise users is they get really canny to how you've developed your app, and they know how to navigate their way through it way faster than even you as a developer knows. And they know where all the tricks are to put in like no data. If they can possibly get away with giving you no data, they'll just do that and then hit next. So I see some people nodding in the audience. This is obviously a common thing or a common theme. So it's worth just checking your validations and making sure that your app's well tested before it goes out to general release. So yeah, basically meeting consumer expectations is fairly straightforward, but it's all about performance. So throw away what you don't need, keep the app as lightweight as possible, ultimately deliver them a good user experience and a good UI. That will get you better ratings in general. And last but not least, collect feedback on the app. So you can either do that by custom rolling your own mechanism to do that, or you can install analytics and then see which parts of the app are being used most commonly. Great thing is that this is still just the web, so you can use Google Analytics if you want, and it's very easy to integrate that. Or you can find there are various mobile app analytics tools that you can use as well, and they'll even give you things like crash reports, so that if the whole framework crashes inside Cordova, you get a report there, and they'll give you things about push notifications and all sorts of other useful things. So some of them are free and some of them are paid for. It just depends on what you've got. So here's an example. Simple app, keep the menu as simple as possible, humongous buttons, nice easy things for people to read, and then ultimately carry out consumer surveys to make sure that it still meets their needs even 6 months down the line. So screen size, this is important. So your iPad or your iPhone or a tablet or smartphone obviously have different screen sizes, that's a given, but you can actually consider how you develop the layout of your app to suit both. On the newer iPads anyway, and some of the Android devices, you're actually able to open 2 apps at the same time, and this is quite interesting workflow for us, but it also means that the likelihood is that you may have the app open on a full screen in your iPad, and then all of a sudden the user's squishing that down to 50%. So that's good in a way, until you realize then actually your layout has broken. So there's a quick trick around this, and if you use a responsive CLS tag in the config, basically you can create a responsive app, and responsive applications allow your components to change shape and size depending on the screen resolution that's presented to them. So it's really quite straightforward to do in CSS. I'm not going to go into any detail into how to do it with CSS, but responsive CLS is basically the tag that you're looking, or the config option that you're looking for in a Sencha app, and that will give you everything that you need. So I was actually going through my slides. I've not really picked a great example here, but basically what does this show? It shows the text has ellipsis on the iPhone, and on the iPad, because there's more space, there's no ellipsis there. Some of that's not provided out the box, would you believe, in lists and so on. So you may have to get clever with your CSS to make sure that that sort of thing happens. It's always worth having your QA team just double check that everything falls back nicely whenever you're working with the app on a smaller device. So this is number 9. So data-driven apps that build themselves. This is something that we come up against quite a lot now, and basically you're given the requirement where the customer firstly doesn't know what device they want to deploy to, and then secondly they want it to be infinitely flexible. So these are the 2 things that we get told time and time again. So what can we do to do that? Well, we can build metadata and store it in a database or at the back end, and then put that on the front end, and then build screens that are appropriate to that particular user's session. I bet you're already doing some of this in desktop apps, and certainly in website development and things like that. That's very common. Really good thing about this, though, is that if you deploy an app like this and you write it well the first time round, then you don't need to necessarily deploy the app every time your business comes to you and says, I need a field change. So a great example is recently we deployed an app for a bank, and they were collecting some data on their customers. They forgot to put the gender field in, so we went out to App Store, we went through all the pain of that, and then 3 days later they came back and said, oh, stop, we need to capture gender. So, okay, we have to go through the whole process of writing that into the app, which is fine, but then deploying it again, which takes another 2-3 days. If you have all of that sort of stuff done through metadata in the database, then you wouldn't need to deploy. You could just do a quick tweak to the database, and then everybody would automatically see that particular field. So it can be a very powerful way to build an application. Ultimately, how else can you do this? You can also store config files on the device, and if you use Cordova, that'll give you a way to store basically to store files in the file system of the handset. And then the only thing that I would definitely say is consider validators. So if you're validating data with the front end, just make sure that you write a good validation engine on the front end to be able to interpret what your metadata is meant. Otherwise, you'll end up with the problem that I had before, where our customers were just skipping through all the fields because we didn't actually set them as required, because it wasn't set as required in the database. So just a very brief example. So basically, this customer sends a config file with their app to the device whenever they push it out of their enterprise app store. Then it checks the backend to see if there is a new config file available. This is really simple code to write. If it does find a new config file available to that user, it will then download it onto the device and then store it there forevermore until it checks again. And then that just gives the customer, in this case, the ability to change the way that the app interfaces for that particular user, and they can capture the relevant data that they need to. So last but not least, and this is hybrid versus native, and basically, although with a hybrid app you can deploy to the App Store through your wrapper like Cordova, sometimes you just have to go native. But going native means all sorts of problems. You've got to learn Java or Objective-C or Swift. You might get faster performance, but it can cost a lot more, and ultimately it's not what you really want to do. So we found a new way for doing this. And for us, I mean, and this is quite commonplace now, but we've started using React Native on some applications. So most of our applications we're still building with Sencha, but every now and then we need to build the front end using React Native, and it just gives us the ability to give a slightly slicker look and feel to the app, particularly when it comes to interactions and for consumer applications, it can be particularly useful. I wouldn't do it though if I was building an enterprise app. I think Sencha is absolutely the way to go, because with React you've got to write your views twice. You have to know something about Apple and or the iOS ecosystem and the Android ecosystem in order to develop a React Native app. So it's not as simple as writing a Sencha app. So it's definitely worth considering, having a look at, and evaluating as part of your evaluation whenever you're building your apps. But and that's what we do. So just before I finish up, so how do all these tools fit together? Well, or how do all the Sencha tools fit together in this? Well, basically, you would kick your build off with something like Sencha Architect normally, and generate your new application using Sencha command. Key thing is here, use Chrome because it's a WebKit browser, and you'll need Chrome developer tools a lot for debugging your application as you're building it. And then ultimately you can go through the ability to test and build your app with Sencha command again. And last but not least, you can also use Sencha command to build the Cordova app for you too. So basically that will help get it deployed out to the app stores. It looks really simple when I put it in a workflow like that. It looks great, but in reality, it is a wee bit more in depth and involved than that. But that's basically that. So that's everything from me. If you have follow-on questions or general queries, you can email me, or if you read our blog, we have lots of interesting Sencha-related articles that you might find of use to you at some point. And yeah, I'm open. I think I've got about 5 minutes left, so I can take a few questions just now. And the other thing I've got to do briefly is, the other day we had whiskey on our stand. Some of you may have noticed it. So I need to give whiskey away just now. And I've got a bucket of business cards here, so I'm going to pick a few business cards out at the very end, and then maybe someone in the audience will actually will walk away with some whiskey today. That'd be quite nice. So, any questions? Hello.
It was interesting to hear you say that you're using React Native. I'm curious as to if you spent much time, or do you spend much time on just regular React as opposed to...
So the question is, do we use regular React as well as React Native? Actually, no. We haven't built any other apps using React. We do with Angular, so we build quite a few with Angular, but none with React itself, and we've just gone straight to React Native. And it's a good framework. You know, it's still in its infancy, but the traction on the framework is massive. I think it's one that's worth looking at for consumer applications, I would say. Anybody else? Any questions? We're going straight to the whiskey then. Is that the plan? Oh, we've got one more. Okay.
Do you recommend using Crosswalk for Android?
Good question. That I don't know. I haven't used it myself. I'm going to look at my developers who are sitting in the audience. Guys, have you used that before? No. No, Eva? No? No, I don't know is the answer. Sorry. I wish I did. I'll look into it. Right, okay, well, if we have no other questions, in that case, I will pick some names out of the bucket. Let's see. And maybe someone's here, who knows. If not, we'll have to go and hunt them down in one of the other sessions. Right, I need to be able to read the handwriting on the thing. That doesn't help. That's really bad. It's a bad start, isn't it? Aha, right, okay, we've got Ryan Flores. Is Ryan here by any chance? He's not. Okay, well, we will find him, and he has won some whiskey. Nice, well done to him. I should have changed this game and made it just you guys. Yeah. You needed to come and visit us the other day. Right, here's one here. This is a business card, Jace Bennett from Assess Tech. Oh, you're here, nice. You have one Glenmorangie. This is a good everyday whiskey. You drink it every day, okay? There you go, well done. So, well, that's us finished then. In that case, if you've got any questions or anything, you can come and find me afterwards. And I hope you enjoy the rest of CentraCon, and we'll catch up with you soon. Thanks.